intent that the public health effects of biomass be studied, isn't there?
Absolutely. I to put it back at you, Senator, and I don't mean to be dismissive, the legislature clearly could have required more substantive changes to our regulations if they had decided. So I think that the legislature made a decision that this requires more study, but that it should not preclude regulations from going forward. At least that's my interpretation of the study.
All right, not to belabor the point, but you're insisting that the legislature concluded that the matter deserves more study, but that you should go ahead anyway.
It did certainly not have any legislation that precludes this regulation from going forward.
Okay. What is the statutory basis for the regulations that you propose to promulgate?
So that is under the Green Communities Act governing the RPS provisions.
So that would be Section 11F of Chapter 25A.
That's correct.
And can you quote any provision of Section 11F of Chapter 25A that expresses legislative intent that you single out certain towns for these facilities and absolutely rule out others?
We certainly have had, we're trying to respond really to what we saw with the legislation enacted to be extremely careful with environmental justice populations. So within that construct, we are certainly trying to respond to public comment as well as legislative action with the Climate Act. We have in other policies, most notably solar, really tried to consider land use that does have restrictions on eligibility, somewhat consistent to what we are proposing here.
As long as you mention the environmental justice provisions, and I thank you for referencing them, the legislature amended the so-called MEPA law, the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act, when we added the environmental justice provisions to the Massachusetts statutes books. And as you know, MEPA has to do with enhanced review of the environmental effects of proposed infrastructure or construction projects. So in legislative parlance, that would be, again, Section 62 of Chapter 30. But you've taken our legislatively mandated language for MEPA and you've extended it to a different part of the Massachusetts laws, Chapter 25A. Did the legislature define any of these terms and extend them to Chapter 25A?
No, Senator. And I certainly want to be clear that that orange that you see there, any facility can be proposed in these facilities. It's whether they can be eligible for the Massachusetts incentive program. The climate bill was historic. It has changed the paradigm with permitting, and with incentive programs, we wanted to be careful with certainly alignment with the legislative action. We did receive overwhelming public support for this provision, and certainly open to feedback from the committee on it.
I dare say members of the committee would support the extension of protections to environmental justice populations. But just to be clear, the legislature expressly added these terms to Massachusetts law, and I'm now quoting from the Climate Act, for the purposes of Section 61 to 62L of Chapter 30. So the legislature's intent was to take these policy innovations and extend them for the purposes of ensuring enhanced review of the environmental implications of new construction and infrastructure. That would be MEPA, so-called. But on your own, you've taken these concepts which aren't even effective yet. We've actually delayed the effective date of all these, of the 5-year buffer zone idea, for example, until December of this year, because we did view working out regs as so sensitive. So you've taken concepts written for Chapter 30 and intended, and I just quoted for Chapter 30 alone, you've imported them yourselves on your own authority into Chapter 25A and the RPS program, even though they're not even effective yet for MIPA itself. There are no 5-mile buffer zones in effect yet for enhanced review of the environmental effects of new construction. That will come, and I hope soon, but it's not in effect because we know, again, that it's complicated. Why move ahead on something that's not even in effect and was reserved for MIPA? Why on your own authority import it into the RPS program when we can't find anything in Section 11F of Chapter 25A that authorizes you to do that?
Yeah, I certainly open to feedback. We're certainly trying to respond to a significant change that the legislature enacted. These would likely be to take effect under a regulatory schedule in October, and open to feedback if there should be further alignment with the date of effect of the MIPA requirements.
You agree that the legislature could have defined environmental justice population for the purposes of the RPS program, but did not? Because you just pointed out that the legislature has discretion on these matters.
Absolutely, Senator.
So we chose not to do so. Our legislative intent was to reserve these policy innovations at the moment for Chapter 30, the MIPA provisions. But on your own, you've hopscotched over to an entirely new area of law and acted without any authorization in Chapter 25A.
We did. We put these out for public comment, received overwhelming support for this provision.
Well, I thank you for coming before the legislature, which of course is always concerned to protect its prerogative to legislate and to make sure that the executive branch carries out legislative intent but does not exceed it, as may well have been the case here. Let's look at the map, if we might, Mr. Commissioner, just for a moment. I want to thank you for being absolutely transparent, you and your staff. And when Representative Roy and I asked you to map out the implications of your written policy, you did produce this map for us, but it was not a part of the regs you issued. It was not released publicly until the committee requested it. Was it in existence before Mr. Roy and I requested it?
We did not have this specific map, no.
So without the map, it's hard to visually understand which parts of Massachusetts you've left vulnerable, isn't it?
I disagree with the assessment of vulnerable. We did certainly know that when we reviewed the legislation with the MIPA standard, that it would be an expansive scope of cumulative impact review for MIPA purposes.
Again, I don't think anyone on this committee is arguing with your wish to protect environmental justice populations, but the decision to go with a 5-mile buffer when air travels across hundreds of miles, and before the legislature's authorized 5-mile buffers for the MIPA Act itself, seems to have been an extraordinary exercise of regulation making by your agency. The rest of us, including
I will certainly agree that we took the feedback from the public about the impacts of biomass on environmental justice populations extremely seriously. And this is a significant change, and again, open to feedback. We are trying to respond to the Climate Act and also to a lot of public input, Senator.
And I appreciate that, but with the public comment that you received, had you shared this map with commentators at the time that they made their comments?
As you noted, this map was developed in response to your request a few weeks ago. So no.
Had you shared with commentators at the time they made their comments the list of towns with significant land area vulnerable to siting?
I mean, I think we all know that there was an understanding when the Climate Act passed that the changes would have a broad impact on a lot of towns, as indicated by this map.
My staff, Mr. Commissioner, has done a calculation. The best we can make out, the particular regulation you propose makes rec-eligible biomass prohibited in 89% of the land area of Massachusetts, leaving just 11% vulnerable to biomass siting, new for siting, I mean. I think all of us on this committee, and I know everyone in the executive branch, believes in proportionate burden sharing rather than disproportionate harm. But this seems to be a case not of sharing burdens, but of concentrating burdens on the remaining 11% of Massachusetts. How does concentrating the burden square with the intuitive feeling that burden sharing is okay, but disproportionate harm is to be avoided?
I guess I disagree with the fundamental assertion that this will lead to more burden in those facilities. All of our analysis is yielding a conclusion that we not see significant new biomass facilities proposed, irrespective of these regulations.
Well, I take your point. I think you've declared in all but formal official language that there aren't going to be any new biomass facilities in Massachusetts, and that's fine by DOER. So why, again, to echo Senator Hines and Senator O'Connor, not make it official? Why not ask this committee to support legislation removing biomass as a Class 1 renewable resource? You're often communicating with us with respect to legislation. The clear thrust of these regs is to formally expose 11% of Massachusetts to disproportionate impacts, but the informal thrust seems to be inimical to additional biomass in Massachusetts. Why not urge us to make what is all but official, official?